Okay, welcome back. We're still on page 86 talking about government governance outcomes. Some sort of strategic alignment. So with the government governance should make sure that all the business needs first thing that we talked about back in chapter 2, all that stuff is met. Risk management plan, yeah, because somebody has to set what the risk tolerance is. I'm willing to let some things go, but not this over here. Somebody up at the top needs to make those kind of decisions, because you, as an implementer, you can't decide what's important and what's not. A resource management plan, again, who gets the money to do all this stuff? Because you might come up with a plan that, we need all this hardware, we need intrusion detection systems, we need wireless intrusion detection systems, we need a new router, we need this, the other. It comes up with this huge amount, and somebody's going to have to pay the bill. And, money is not infinite. You're probably not going to get everything you want in the first year. Performance measurement. How are you going to tell whether or not stuff is working? Is the number of incidents going down? Ooh, now that's tough, okay? That is really tough. First of all, it's tough to measure. It's sort of like I remember one time 10 million years ago where they were doing a performance review and trying to come up with key KPIs, key performance indicators. And one of the ones they came up with to determine whether the fire department was doing a good job was the number of calls to a fire. And I'm thinking, that's the exact opposite. I mean, wouldn't you praise the fire department for preventing fires rather than responding to them? Right? Okay. That's kind of the same thing here. Not having breaches is more important than collecting the statistics on the breaches that did occur, right? The ones that did not occur are the ones that are important. Those are the ones you have to measure, and there is no measure for things that don't exist. And then value delivery. You have to be able to convince people in management that what you're doing down there in the security office or the IT department has value to the company. Okay. So planning levels on page 87. So you start with a strategic plan, typically long-term, and that long-term means different to different companies. And then you have individual tactical plans. These are the short-term things. Okay, in order to meet the goal of 30% in 2 years, we need to build another store here, or we need to increase another market, or we need to introduce a new product, or whatever it is that you're doing. And so those are individual targeted things that are designed to help accomplish the major goal. Then you have operational plans. It's like, what do you want me to do? Not pie in the sky, but do this. Go to this marketing plan and make this change. Introduce this. The actual specific. So a strategic plan basically tells you what you're doing. What needs to be done in order to accomplish the goal. It could be 2 years, could be 10 years, but what needs to be done? The tactical plan is how are you going to do it? This is typically, 1 to 2 years, again, depending on the scale. So tactical plans include the budget and personnel requirements. Oh, for goodness sake, don't ever lose that part. Otherwise, you're always going to be asked, do more with less. I hate that, okay? And the rules. If you're coming up with a tactical plan and you're going to be measuring performance, this is true of any type of performance measurement, whether it be, a salesman or security people. Its 3 rules are always the same. First of all, the goal has to be achievable, has to be something that can be done. It has to be measurable, because if you can't measure it, you'll never know whether or not you succeeded. And then you have to have a time frame constraint. In my world, when we were doing this, if we said, okay, we're going to increase efficiency of this operation by 10% in 12 months. Okay, you were never allowed to go back and alter the goal. You couldn't say, 12 months. There was a storm and there was this and we had a layoff and so we're not going to be able to make. No, you have to stay with once you got that tactical plan up, you're not allowed to go in and change the goalposts. Okay, so. An example would be, increase the market share by 15%. The goal is 20%, but maybe 5% this year and 5% this year, that kind of stuff. And then the operational plans is the ongoing day-to-day operation, weekly meetings and progress reports and lots of communication. But it's all about what it is you want me to do. Because a tactical plan about, okay, we're going to do 5% increase in okay, great, but what do you want me to do? That's what that operational plan is. What do you want me to do? Okay, planning in the CISO, page 87. So getting the first priority for coming up with this thing is a strategic plan. Now, let me just give you a crazy story that I heard from some motivational speaker that came to talk to us years ago. So I can't even validate whether this is a true story, but it's a good story nevertheless. All right, here's how it goes. So this guy was trying to do an efficiency review of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, okay? And he went to the chief and said, so what is the goal, overall goal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs? And he says, oh, well, the goal is to assimilate the Native American cultures into mainstream U.S. And he went, okay. So he went down and talked to one of the BIA people on the ground and said, what is the goal of BIA? And the guy says, well, is to preserve the integrity of the social structure and all that stuff and not have it, dissolve. Like, what? One is to make the unique individual culture go away and dissolve, and one is not. So, yeah. So the point of that story was, there was a huge disconnect between the top and the bottom. The top says we're going that way, and the bottom said we're going that way. Yeah. So the first goal is to produce a strategic plan that everyone goes, typically a top-down approach at this point, because, the CIO or CISO is going to produce this plan based upon what the CEO says is the business needs. So it's got to include a lot of non-IT things in there, about security, and you could be talking about, guns, guards, and gates kind of a thing. I need to have a more secure building. We need to put up a chain link fence, and we need to put security cameras on the corners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, it could be an awful lot more people involved in it rather than just IT. Okay, so on page 88, they talk about the policy, standards, and practices. And one of the quotes is, good programs begin and end with policy. Okay, great. So InfoSec is more management related than technology related. In other words, those pesky humans are the problem. It's not, we'll add more security cameras and we'll add more intrusion detections and locks on doors. Okay, yes, great. But InfoSec has an awful lot more to do with, changing the hearts and minds of the people. So the development of these plans is not really all that costly. Now, implementing them might be. So policy as a foundation, page 88, just like a law would be. You need to tell them what is acceptable and not acceptable. What is unacceptable behavior? And what are the penalties if you don't comply? All right? So here's a kind of an example of how these things work. So a policy is, top level policy. Use strong passwords and frequently change them. Okay, that's kind of a general thing. A standard would be your passwords have to be 10 characters, has to have, upper and lower numbers and symbols. A practice is, most organizations require their employees to change every 6 months. A procedure is, in order to do this, go here and click on this. And then the guidelines is, we recommend you don't use this and this and this and this and this and this and this. So those kind of the differences between the policy, standards, and practices. Okay, so sanctioned by management, obviously these things have to come from the top. Minimum specifications like 10 characters and don't do this, and then instructions on how to comply. All right, so here's a different view of that very same thing. So you start with policies, and then you produce some standards, and then you produce guidelines, and then you actually have to tell them how to do it, the procedures part. Okay, it's basically the same stuff. It's just, so one more time, using as example password. The policy says you got to have strong passwords. The standard is, 10 characters long with blah, 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 blah. Guidelines are, here's how, some instructions on how to pick a good password. And then the procedures are, go to group policy and enforce this, and to give them instructions on exactly how to go to where to go to click on stuff. Figure out, some sort of a automated system to remind them that their password's going to expire before the date. By the way, changing the subject slightly. let's say that you're in a paranoid situation and somebody comes and says, we're going to change the, you used to change the passwords once a year. Okay. And they come in and say, oh, no, that's not good. We're going to change them every month. Okay, wait, let's just make this more insane. If I said we're going to change your password every 2 weeks, what would you do? And it's a randomly generated password that I'm going to provide to you. Okay, this is just hypothetical, right? What would you do? You'd write it down, wouldn't you? If it changes every 2 weeks, I'm not going to bother to remember, particularly if it's just some random garbage. So you can see how you can kind of go overboard. You can think you're tightening security by having the passwords change frequently and end up not helping security at all. Okay, so there's 3 types of policy. We talked about this: an enterprise security plan, an issue specific, and a system specific. So the enterprise plan on page 91. So this is an executive level document, right? It's used to guide the development of the entire security. It has legal issues involved, compliance things like, we have the authority to monitor your activity. Well, who gave you the right to spy on me? The CEO did, okay? The CEO said, we have the right to monitor your web activity. Yes. Okay, top level stuff. And then compliance and disciplinary action. You ought to be, you don't have to go into detail at the top, but you got to say, if you don't comply, it could cost you your job. Okay. So elements of the enterprise information security plan: some sort of corporate philosophy, an organizational structure showing how things work, responsibilities for everyone, and then a separate section on the responsibilities of the IT security people. So here's kind of sort of what this thing looks like. So the components, some sort of purpose. Why are we doing this? Identifying these things. And then information security essentials, protecting blah, 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 blah. The need, the roles, organizational chart, and then list all the standards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a halfway decent way of looking at this. Okay. So next, let's talk about on page 91, the issue specific. So, for example, do we allow you to check your personal email while you're sitting at the office? Is that allowed? I would hope the answer is yes. Okay, I would hope. Or use your work email for some minor, private things, like I sent a note to my spouse saying I'm going to be late for dinner, that kind of stuff. All right. So working on a work computer, they typically do allow you some leeway, as long as it doesn't, interfere with normal business. So a common topic in issue specific is the use of email and the web and the prohibition of hacking. Bring your own device policy. Work from home policy, the use of the photocopy machine. External storage devices. Can I plug in a USB drive? That kind of stuff. And if you have cloud-based storage that run by the company, they probably are going to be blocking the private stuff. You won't be able to use Dropbox or your own private OneDrive or anything like that, or any of the Amazon equivalents. So if they have a corporate version, they're probably going to clamp down on the non-corporate versions. Oddly enough, we don't have bring your own device policy. I think that's kind of weird. I'm not sure why that is, but we do have a document in supplemental material that's the acceptable use policy for the university. It's a good document to take a peek at. But it's kind of strange that we don't have a bring your own device. Okay, on page 93 is the typical components of an issue specific. This is pretty straightforward stuff. Scope and applicability and authorized access and prohibited use, system management, violations of policies, and, how do you report and what kind of penalties they are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, for example, it very well could be that, if you are caught, doing business on your machine or going to some important site, they ought to be able to say, this is a fireable offense, right there. Okay, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark.